right, so I'm going to try and put 12 hours of training into 40 minutes for you guys, so we're going to go quick. I'm Ivan Likens, I'm the product manager of Connect. I also actually take care of the Sitecore connectivity program right now, which has a whole bunch of products and things we're doing at Sitecore. So when we look at that, the Better Together story, there's front-end integrations and there's back-end integrations. And in the back-end, we're mainly looking at events and data. And in the front-end, yeah, you've seen some of those integrations come to fruition recently, like, for example, in Send, you saw the Content Hub DAM being added. And if I'm right, then right about this time inside of Pages, you should also be seeing the Content Hub DAM showing up. So that's really nice. When we look at third-party connectivity, however, we're adding something new to our portfolio, and that's Sitecore Connect. And this was actually launched, well, it was announced on Symposium, and then it was launched the 16th of January. So it's been around already for a while. And I know people haven't been getting access to it just yet, but that has been resolved. There is a form right now, which, if you're interested, I can get you that link and you can sign up for a sandbox if you're a partner. Now, Connect is part of the Engagement Cloud. And inside of the Engagement Cloud, we actually have 4 different products: CDP, Send, Personalize, and obviously Connect itself. Today, we're going to look at Connect. And when we started with Connect, we actually white-labeled something called Workato. So Connect is not built in-house at Sitecore. It is a partnership. And we'll also be referring to them for any kind of documentation and training. So if you're interested in a lot of the stuff that I'll be showing and you want to deep dive on that, there's a whole lot you can learn from the documentation and the academy training of Workato. Now, why did we choose Workato? Now, there's a good number of reasons for it. They are a customer's choice in the Cloud 100. They're a 5-year leader in the iPaaS quadrant of our friends at Gartner. COE invests in enterprise automation, IDC report, if you're interested. And obviously, there's many more studies from Forrester as well on this topic. And it is the only industry leader that's 100% cloud native. So it fits really well with Sitecore's Composable and Sitecore's vision on this regard. So 101, there's a couple of topics I need to introduce. And we're going to start with connections, recipes, data, and tasks. Because these are words, if you start talking about Sitecore Connect, then they'll always pop up, and they each have a specific meaning. And I've had a hard time trying to explain some of them, because the first one, connections, when you say a connection, most people think of the whole of a connection. But actually, that's not what a connection is in Workato. And if you've been to Sarah's talk, then you might actually have seen some of those connections already. They're more of a set of credentials towards a system. And why is this important, and why am I highlighting this, is because connections is the primary entitlement of Connect. So this is what drives pricing. So we have several tiers of several volumes of connections that we sell. And obviously, the more you use, the more expensive things get. So let me give you an example on connections. A customer corporation wants to connect their CDP with Google Ads. think that sounds very familiar, those that have seen Sarah's talk. So if that company has 3 ad accounts, one for each brand that they own, they're actually going to use 4 connections. There's going to be 1 connection that goes to Sitecore CDP. That one you're getting for free from us. So you don't need to count that, but it will show up as a connection. And then you need 3 different connections to Google Ads, because you're actually using 3 different accounts. So you will need to set up 3 different connections. So that brings you into tier 2 of our buckets of connections. Then recipes. Recipes is if you see a connection and you have the left side system, right side system, the recipe is what happens in between those 2. Obviously, more complex recipes, you can have a 4th or a 5th or a 6th connection. But in that case, I would actually tell you to do a couple of things differently, which we'll see in a second. So all recipes are started by a trigger. And there are a lot of triggers available. They describe a set of actions that are executed over the available connections. Important detail when you're working with Sitecore Connect is that each recipe must have at least 1 connection to Sitecore. And this is important because that is what you buy Sitecore Connect for. If you want to integrate with other systems and between those systems and you're not including Sitecore in there, then you're going to need to acquire an instance of Workato itself. And it is possible to use those side by side, no problem, because as I'm showing you, pricing is being driven by usage. So whether you use 2 accounts, 3 accounts, 4 accounts, doesn't really matter. It's how much you use them. So we have a couple of triggers, and this is the whole set. And I'm going to go through them one by one just to introduce all of them. So first one is the one a lot of people are going to be using is the apps. The apps themselves, or the connectors to those apps, they give you sets of triggers. And this is the sent one. And you can see here it has a new subscriber and updated profile. So when these things happen, automatically your recipe will start running. And I'm going to highlight these from Salesforce for a second, because you're going to see a couple of interesting ones in there showing the red batch tag, which means that these are really meant to bring in larger sets of data that you can start working on. Schedule is the next one, and that's one that Sarah also shortly highlighted. It's very useful to plan when your recipes run, so it's your basic cron job. If you need something done on a certain time, this is the way to do it. And you'll notice here also I expanded the set trigger condition, and this is just to show this exists on almost all of the triggers. But you can use it to decide whether or not when this trigger comes in, you actually want to execute the whole flow or not. So it's handy for filtering out things. Webhooks, another one that was shown before. So they're the staple of cloud integration. I think all of you have or will at some point in time be using a webhook. And they're so easy to deal with. So if you use the guided setup, you literally just give that thing a name. It will start listening for a event to come through. It will give you the URL that has been created. And then when it receives that event, it will automatically generate a schema out of the event that it received. That includes headers as well as body. So that will give you all of those things automatically, neatly set up and available in your recipe as data. Then the managed example is an interesting one, because these are the platform triggers themselves. So if you wanted to, you could monitor Workato using Workato. We have a couple of more inception kind of loops like that, because, for example, we also, inside of Sitecore, deploy our own connectors using Workato to Workato. There's a lot of capabilities in here, really handy for monitoring and sending alerts or doing orchestration, which is another word that you might have heard yesterday in Steve Davis' talk. Function examples. Obviously, some recipes might become too big, and that's why I said, like, oh, when you're heading into the 6, 7, 8 connections in a single recipe, I would have a look at functions, break that down, bring them into smaller pieces that you can reuse and which are just more simple to deal with. There is one in the list that you might have noticed. I said a crossover, which is a for now thing, and that's the API endpoint trigger. We currently have not licensed this part. If we see there is a big ask for it, then we might consider licensing it. It's just an add-on feature from Workato. So they have a whole API platform system that we could enable if we really wanted to. But this would essentially allow you to create an endpoint that you can call with a payload that functions like an API, basically. So it's similar to webhooks, but you can actually return a response as well. So that almost turns it into an Azure function of some kind. Then we have bots, which is the last trigger that I'm going to be talking about. So 3 kinds of bots. We have Slack, we have Teams, and we have Workplace. And as you can see, progressively things get slimmer. So the Slack integration obviously is the deepest one. Teams is fairly well and good as well. And then Workplace is really just for commands. So there's more capabilities depending on which bot you use. And then Workato asks you the best question: what happens next? So once you're past your trigger, you go into action territory. And the first up is apps again. And as you can see, we have our own apps up there already in the Workato platform. We will be adding the missing pieces as soon as possible. And obviously, you can pull from a whole host of apps that Sarah showed it for a second there. It's a very big library. Now, apps, just as the triggers, they have a certain set of capabilities that they will offer to you. This is the set of CDP. So you have the audience sync files, the batch upload. And then I just want to highlight that last one down there for a second as well. That's called custom action. You're actually going to see that in a couple of our connectors that currently only have custom actions available. And that means that when you pick that one, you actually set up your whole call yourself. So it gives you full control, but it will use the authentication of the connection, which makes it really easy to make calls to these systems. And this is how that looks. So you give it a name, you tell it what the method is, then what the path is. And the help here is closed right now because to get a whole screenshot in here, but in the help is a link towards the REST documentation, which basically tells you, like, these are the calls you can make. And then you set up any headers and the request body schema. And this is also mainly handy if you have variable schemas. There are ways to solve that we will be doing in the future for you, because Content Hub schema, for example, is very complex, because every time you change something or you introduce a different entity type, then all of that needs to happen dynamically as well. There's a couple of apps I want to highlight that are apps of interest. And these are basically tools from the Workato platform that you use to do basic things. For example, variables. If you want to create a variable to store certain data that you're doing some special calculations on, that's there. Lists is another one that you will use often, especially in combination with the next action I will talk about. There are also, at the bottom right there, JavaScript, Python, and Ruby. So Sarah was executing some Python, but if you don't like Python or you don't know how to write it, you can try JavaScript, which most people are fairly familiar with, I would say, definitely with our headless stories. And Ruby is the platform native language, actually. So that's why Ruby is in there as well. You'll see there are a couple of them that also have a lock over them right now. And those, again, are add-ons that we currently haven't activated, which if we see a need and ask for it from the community and from our clients, we can actually acquire these and make them available. All right, logic. I'm standing in front of a developer audience, so I don't think I need to explain these two. If we haven't seen if, else, then what are we doing? And I think the next one is the one I mentioned also in combination with lists a lot. Yeah, where we need that for each. I do want to highlight that, as you might have noticed, there is no while here. So if you want to do a while loop inside of Workato, you have to do a little bit of trickery right now, which is creating a list of a certain size, going into the loop over that list and like checking whether or not you've reached the end or not, and then basically hop out of it by doing some conditionals. Workato knows that this is really not a great experience, so they have it on the roadmap to bring while into the platform fairly soon. Then calling functions, obviously, because we've just seen like you can set up recipes for functions, so that means you need an action to call functions. And the nice part here is that, as you can see, you can call them synchronously or asynchronously, which actually gives you the opportunity of running certain recipes in parallel. So if you have data coming in that needs to happen, a lot of stuff going to different locations, and you know, like, oh, I don't depend on the answer of those things, then by all means, run them in parallel. It will go a lot faster. This one is also one of the very simple ones. It just stops what it's doing. And you get the choice, did I succeed or did I fail? Then for handling errors, we have this block. Fairly self-explanatory again. Everything you put underneath the monitor will essentially be running in some sort of a try-catch situation. And when an error happens, it will jump down into the next part. And this also offers you some retry capabilities, so you can actually set that up to automatically retry a couple of times before it goes entirely into failure. So that's a nice way of making things a little bit more robust. A bit of cooking tips for your recipes. The first one I highly recommend is use the comment feature so that your recipes actually become very self-explanatory. Workato already is pretty good in that regard. So, but if you add your own comments explaining certain steps, things, you just open that up, it's immediately clear what's going on. Masking sensitive data. Sarah really neatly showed that as well in her talk. Allows you to basically get rid of any kind of trace data that would normally be available for the purposes of data privacy and data security. Before I go to this one, I also have to mention there is a data retention policy of 90 days. That's the maximum amount of time something can live at Workato. After that, everything is destroyed. So Workato is also not a place where you store data. It's a transient spot. Making use of function recipes, I actually already highlighted this. What many don't know, however, which a sales engineer brought to me a couple of weeks ago, was like, yeah, I'm trying to set up this recipe and I need to connect to 2 different environments of Sitecore, and I can't do it. I'm like, that's odd. Let me have a look with you. And effectively, inside of a single recipe, if you target an app, that app for the entirety of that recipe can only be tied to one single connection. And that's why in a couple of the cases, if you start browsing through Workato's catalog of app connections, you're actually going to see the same app twice, but with a name secondary. And that's how they circumvent not being able to tie those neatly together. So use some function recipes to get rid of that problem and move that connection into that location. Having a naming convention, that's definitely going to help you find whenever something's going wrong, but it's just good practice, and this is actually also something you learn when you follow the Academy of Workato. So this is how they recommend you name your recipes. The guideline is 30 steps per recipe. That's the Workato default. Use trigger conditions. I mentioned this already. There's this filtering that you can do on the trigger conditions. A bit later on, I'm going to explain you why that's so important. Handle errors, obviously. And customize your job table for quick insights. Now, every time you run a recipe, a job is created. And if you want to have quick insights into what that job was doing or what kind of data was happening in that job, you can actually set up the job table to show you a couple of those parameters, which can give you a really quick insight like, oh, this job was run for person A to give them a raise, for example, because HR loves Workato. So quickly gonna check out data. Sarah again showed this live. You can drag and drop from the recipe data into all of the input and output fields that you find. So when you do so, this thing is actually called a data pill. So that's the name Workato uses for this. So you drag that and it will write out itself into that location. Obviously you can use values that you are setting yourself and you can combine them. So if you have like a piece where you're like taking a name and then writing some message, you can very easily do that and it will compose itself. If you want to compose it in a more complicated way, or you're doing some data transformations and stuff, there's formula mode. This one follows a Ruby syntax, but as you can see, it actually gives you very nice inline help. So if you start typing and you do a dot, it will show you all the functions you can take on that particular piece of, on that particular data pill or variable that you have going on. And yeah, use them for complex data. And data pills function as variables or properties with read-only capability. So don't try to set them in formula mode. That doesn't work. Then we come to the topic of tasks. And tasks is the other important piece in pricing. So this is why I'm going to try and explain to you really carefully how tasks work, because this is how you can go from something simple to something extremely expensive. So a task is a unit of work that basically every time your recipe performs an action that takes compute resources, it puts one onto the counter. Every time you use an action provided by one of your connections, it goes onto the counter. And so if you have a batch bulk operation, that actually also only puts one on the counter. So you can see why I wanted to highlight the batch ones, because you can take care of 1,000 records in one go and just one on the counter. So quick overview, one task per step. Most of the logic and all of those things, they're not a task. And the trigger itself is also not a task, which is why those trigger conditions are so important, because they can basically filter out anything you don't want to do, making sure you're not consuming any tasks. So task counting, very simple. It's just 1, 1, 1. The Connect will execute. It triggers, calls a job, and then it just starts counting. All successful actions qualify. So if you have any failures, then they won't, which we'll see in a second. And if you have, if you're looking at the total counts, it's counted per job. So. And obviously, repeat jobs, they do still count. So, because obviously, even though it's a repeat of a prior job, you're still using the same resources. So that just counts as well. That's a nice one. So if you do any ifs, that skips. So only if it's true, then it will be counted. And here's the fact of the retries. So you see the failing task is not being counted, but any task before that is being counted. So if you are retrying a couple of times, that will just start counting. Yep. And then repeats is just times the amount of tasks you have in there, which should be fairly self-explanatory. And that is how you, counting all those things together, get to a total task count for a certain job. And then you have to make a little bit of prognosis. Optimizing the usage. The first question you always have to ask yourself, does this really need to happen in real time? Because if you can wait a little bit and batch things together, you can do it much more efficiently. Obviously, there are things you want to happen at real time, so it can happen. But then you need to be very, very aware of the fact that if you do not exactly know how to control that input, you have a very variable amount on the other end as well, which might be driving cost. Using trigger conditions, again, it's a warning. So use batch triggers and actions as much as you can, because that will allow you to use one task and do 1,000 records instead of, for each record, meaning 1,000 tasks. Use deltas when you can. It just makes for smaller data sets. Don't run the whole thing every single time. Use formulas to do data transformations, and mapper accumulate collections for efficient list transformations, because if you for each through them, it's just times the amount of things you're doing. You can obviously also optimize stuff by running code. So if you have something that is going on, make it some code. Executing that code, also only one task. Group variable declarations, that's something I've seen in the sales engineers a lot. They basically define every variable separately. Not the greatest idea. And the final one is creating a custom connector SDK, because you can put a lot of logic in there and then basically have it as a single app action available, which is a lot easier. So each active connection gives you 3 million tasks per year. And these go into a pool, so it means that it's not being counted against that connection specifically. So you can actually have a connection that is using 10 million tasks, no problem. Then the rest of the pool is just being used by the others. But each active connection adds to the pool. And we won't stop you from creating any additional connections, which is your responsibility. And obviously, we will bill the overages. So that being said, we're going to go through the tools and the connector SDK and the CLI real quick, because I want to leave some room for answers. So what kind of tools can you expect? We have the common data model tools. This is stuff just to build up common data models you're using around, and it can be used for optimizing task usage. It's used by Mapper, by Workato. If you want to see any of these in detail, come see me afterwards. Environment properties, really neat. It's declared for the entire environment, so all the different recipes can listen to a single variable somewhere. Then we have lookup tables. They're basically CSV-like persistent storage. So this is the only data that you can actually store in your Workato account. Max of 100,000 entries, 10 columns, accessible through specific app actions as well. Message templates allows you to compose messages basically for sending out as an SMS or an email. Obviously, don't use these like you would use Sitecore Send. That's not what these are for. These are more for like building out neat emails for monitoring purposes, or for that makes sense in this context, because all of the emails that go out like this, they're actually coming from mailer@workato.com. So most not really good for branding. So that's why don't use it for that. I want to put in this slide real quick, which you've seen from Dave's deck actually, which is tied to the next tool, which is the on-prem groups. So you can actually install an on-prem agent that will allow you to connect to your on-prem installations of Sitecore. You can even read databases directly or files directly if you wanted to. So this agent is very flexible, has a lot of capabilities. People tasks is basically a system for doing approvals. You set them up. They will be sent and dispatched with people task by Workato. You go to a website, you accept or you decline it. Pops up. So there is some Kafka behind the scenes that you can tie into in Workato. So if you are taking in a lot of real-time messages and you want to detach your input and your execution, this is the way to do it. Recipe lifecycle management. Now this is a big one. This is what we also use internally to release our own connectors and everything. But you will see if you get your hands on a client's account, you will see that there is a non-production and a production instance that will be available to you. And this is actually the way you can move your things from non-production to production. We actually move it across 7 different instances, just to give you an idea. So it works really well. So it zips, packages up your JSON and Ruby files that make up your entire stuff. And you can use that also to do source control. So you can pick up those zip packages and put all of those files into source control, so you can have some more insights into changes you're making, etc., etc. Runtime connections, special case. Not going to spend too much time on this because it is very specific to bots, allowing bots to ask the users to authenticate so that you can actually use the user's credentials to take an action instead of a set connection inside of Workato. Then the workbots themselves, this is where you manage your Slack teams and workplace bots. So they're in the tools section as well. And then a special piece is the connector SDK. There are various types of connectors inside of the Workato platform. First one are private connectors. You might have seen when you've seen Sarah's demo that the Google Ads one was being marked as private. Now, the reason for that is because that was actually a connector that existed only for her in her account. The way that she got this was through the community. So you can go to the community and there's community connectors there, but the way it works is they're open source and they will create a copy in your own account of that connector so that you're decoupled from the community version, and you can make changes to those yourself. So if they're great starting points as well. If they already do some piece that you need, or for Google Ads, for example, you needed to add a couple of additional actions that were not in the original version, that's possible. Shared connections, that's basically our side of the story. We share certain connectors with you, which is the way that our connectors are currently distributed. And then there's the platform connectors, which are distributed by Workato. If you want to be building these, you're going to need a little bit of knowledge, basic programming, and these are Ruby, sorry. Setting these up looks a little bit like this. If you want more details on this, see me afterwards, because we're running short on time to go through everything. Two ways to get started. We have the sample code, or if you have an open API specification. Steve mentioned this in his talk yesterday, knowing that it's a problem for me because that part is still in beta and it doesn't support all open API spec tags yet. So sadly, generating a connector off of the open API of Order Cloud currently doesn't work, but Workato is aware of that and they're working on that. Version control. So all the versions are retained. You can comment them, you can go back to them, you can release whichever one you desire, so that's very easy. The debug console, if you're working in the cloud environment, you can really easily, quickly test connections, actions, and triggers. Sadly, does not allow webhook testing. If you want to do that, then you're going to need the CLI. And the CLI, so there's a lot of benefits to the CLI. Unit testing is one of the biggest one, I would say. If you're really thinking, I want to create really good connectors, then CLI is basically the way to go. It's also easier to bring into your source control. Whoa, this table got shifted a little bit. I'll pass out the slides later. You can read deeper into these differences between the CLI and using the web interface. This is something I do want to mention. If you install the CLI, it's kind of an issue. If you follow the documentation, it's not complete. You're going to need to install a couple of additional things. And if you're on Windows, use WSL. There's really no way to get it running on Windows currently. And Workato is aware of that. They want to fix it, but it's tough because they have a couple of dependencies. And then, last but not least, I want to talk a little bit about the community library, which looks like this. And as you can see, Sitecore has published some recipes out there already. But our Sitecore Connect customers are actually sadly barred from publishing because they're a sub-account of our account. So what we're going to do for you guys is we're going to create an open source GitHub repository where you can basically bring your private share links. We will have that be compiled into a release, which you can import through your recipe lifecycle management if you want to. And we will also be distributing those through our own accounts. So we basically enable you guys to bring the recipes out to everyone. And it's going to be on this URL. It's not open yet, so but that will come. I'm afraid I don't have the time for Q&A anymore. 4 minutes? That's good. And if there's any questions.
Why must we connect to Sitecore? Is that limited by your partner agreement with?
Yes, that's contractual because we're using the white label embedded edition, which otherwise we would basically be reselling Workato, but we're in a other sort of agreement.
Because you have a different pricing model than the default Workato, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
I have one question about the data, where it's stored, where it's processed, because for GDPR compliance reasons, this is the question that we always get.
So we offer 5 regions. We have East US, West US, Australia, which is Singapore, and we have Japan and Western Europe.
Just wondering which versions of Sitecore this is compatible with?
It's compatible with all versions of Sitecore because it doesn't really care. It only interfaces with APIs.
About the actions, is there any way to debug doing any breakpoints in it, or how do you debug?
So if you're building your own connector SDK with the CLI, you can debug specific pieces. If you don't have access to that particular connector, then you can test the recipe, and if you are running it, you can actually click the step, and it will show all of the input and all of the output of that step. If something internally goes wrong there, and you don't have access to the connector itself, then you basically have to file a bug report to the owner of that connector. So if that were a Sitecore connector, you can just send it into Sitecore support, and we will look at it. If it's a platform connector of Workato, then still, since it's Sitecore Connect, you can contact our support, and we will actually report that to Workato, which will then go for a fix.
Thank you.
Any more questions? All right. Thanks, Ivan.
Yeah, I'll do. Just to finalize, quick shout out, Brian Bishop, one of our sales engineers, has done an amazing session on using Sitecore Connect to connect Content Hub with ChatGPT and DALL-E. I highly recommend. Sarah did an amazing session on showing how CDP and Connect can be used together. And I did a fireside chat podcast with Joshua where we basically discussed a little bit of that. If you want to reach out to me, find me here. And finally, obviously, thank you to our sponsors.